Ezra Tanner squinted against the merciless Arizona sun, his parched lips cracked and bleeding. 3 days in the Superstition Mountains with only half a canteen left. The gold he'd been chasing for 2 decades remained elusive, but that wasn't what troubled him now. Water. That's what mattered when the thermometer pushed past 100 degrees and the nearest creek had dried to dust. "Steady, Bell," he murmured to his mule, whose head hung low with fatigue. "We'll find water soon enough." He'd been saying that since yesterday. The mountains had always been generous to those who knew their secrets, but this summer had turned crueler than most. Ezra pulled his bandana up to shield his nose from the dust and squinted at the horizon. Nothing but shimmering heat waves and the distant silhouette of Weaver's Needle piercing the cloudless sky. The old prospector reached for his canteen, weighing it carefully. Maybe 4 good swallows left. He'd been rationing since dawn, taking only enough to keep his tongue from swelling. Belle needed water too, but she'd have to wait. They both would. Just a little further, he promised, though he had no idea where they were headed, except away from the sun-baked canyon that had proven barren of both gold and water. That's when he heard it, a low moan carried on the hot breeze. Ezra froze, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt on his hip. 20 years in Apache country had taught him caution. The sound came again, weaker this time. "Hello?" Ezra called, his voice scraping through his dry throat. No answer came, but as he rounded a large boulder, he saw the source. An Apache warrior lay sprawled in the meager shade, one leg bent at an unnatural angle. Blood had soaked through a crude bandage on his thigh, and his chest barely rose with each shallow breath. Ezra's grip tightened on his revolver. The Apache-white conflict had escalated these past months, with raids and counter-raids leaving a trail of bodies across the territory. This man wore the markings of a warrior, not some reservation Indian. The wounded Apache's eyes fluttered open, dark, pain-filled eyes that locked onto Ezra with immediate recognition of what he was, enemy. "You're in a bad way, friend," Ezra said, knowing the man probably didn't understand his words. The warrior's cracked lips moved, forming words in his native tongue that Ezra couldn't comprehend, but the universal gesture that followed needed no translation. A trembling hand reaching toward Ezra's canteen. Ezra hesitated. That half-canteen was his lifeline. Without it, he might not make it back to civilization. The rational choice was clear. Keep walking, save himself. The Apache would likely die anyway. But 20 years in these mountains had taught Ezra more than just caution. It had taught him that the desert didn't care about the wars of men. Out here, there's only the living and the dead. "Damn me for a fool," he muttered, unscrewing his canteen. He knelt beside the wounded man, supporting his head as he tipped the precious water to the Apache's lips. The warrior drank desperately, water spilling down his chin until Ezra pulled the canteen away. "Easy now. Too much at once will make you sick." The Apache stared at him with confusion, then spoke a single word. "Natai." "That your name, Natai?" Ezra asked. The warrior nodded weakly. "I'm Ezra." He tapped his chest. "Ezra." Natai's eyes drifted to the nearly empty canteen, then back to Ezra's face. Something passed between them, acknowledgement perhaps, of what this gesture meant. Ezra examined the leg wound. An old miner like him knew broken bones when he saw them, and this one was bad. The wound itself had festered, angry red streaks climbing up the man's thigh. "You need more than water, friend," Ezra said. "Need to get that leg set and that wound cleaned before the blood poisoning kills you." Night was approaching, temperatures would drop, and Ezra knew he couldn't leave the man to die alone in the wilderness, not after sharing his water. Some choices bound a man. He built a small fire, using the sparse desert brush, and boiled what little water remained to clean the wound. The Apache bore the pain stoically as Ezra worked, only the occasional sharp intake of breath revealing his suffering. As darkness fell, Ezra shared the last of his jerky with the wounded warrior. They sat in silence, two enemies united by the greater enemy of the desert. "I've got to find water come morning," Ezra said, mostly to himself, "for both our sakes." Natai seemed to understand the gravity in Ezra's tone, if not his words. He pointed weakly to the east and spoke several sentences in Apache. "East, huh? You know where water is?" Ezra asked. Natai nodded, then closed his eyes, exhaustion claiming him. Ezra looked at the sleeping warrior, wondering about the choices that had brought them both to this moment. He'd prospected these mountains for 2 decades, searching for gold that always seemed just beyond the next ridge. Instead, he'd found a dying enemy and given away his last chance of survival. "Strange providence," he murmured as he settled down to keep watch through the night. The temperature plummeted as darkness deepened. Ezra pulled his worn blanket over the Apache, whose feverish shivering had grown worse. He'd seen men die from wounds like that before, the fever climbing until it cooked a man's brain in his skull. Sometime in the darkest part of the night, Natai began to mumble deliriously. Ezra caught only one word, repeated over and over: Diablo, the devil. By dawn, Ezra knew he had to move or they'd both perish. He fashioned a travois from branches and his blanket, securing it to Belle, who protested with irritable brays. "I know, girl," Ezra said, stroking her nose. "It's not what any of us planned." He gently moved Natai onto the travois. The warrior was barely conscious now, his skin burning with fever. Following Natai's directions from the night before, Ezra headed east, into the rising sun. Belle's hooves kicked up dust as they traveled, their shadows stretching long behind them. Hours passed. Ezra's tongue felt swollen in his mouth, his lips cracked and bleeding worse than before. Belle's steps grew more labored. The travois left a shallow trail in the dust. Then, just as Ezra began to doubt, the landscape changed subtly. The soil grew darker, vegetation more abundant. They crested a small rise, and there below them lay a hidden canyon with a spring-fed pool gleaming like a sapphire against the rust-colored earth. "You knew your land well," Ezra said to the semi-conscious Apache. He led Belle down to the water. The mule drank deeply, while Ezra filled his canteen and brought water to Natai. The cool liquid seemed to revive the warrior slightly. His fever-bright eyes focused on Ezra with new clarity. "Thank you," Natai said in halting English, surprising the prospector. "You speak my tongue?" "Some words, learned from mission school, before war." Ezra nodded, helping him drink more water. "Well, rest here, get your strength back." As he tended to Natai's wound with fresh water, cleaning away the pus and grime, Ezra felt eyes upon him. He froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing up. Slowly, he turned toward the canyon rim. What he saw made his blood run cold. Silhouetted against the sky stood at least 30 Apache warriors, mounted on ponies, weapons in hand. At their center, a powerfully built man with elaborate war paint and a headdress that marked him as a chief stared down at them with unreadable eyes. Ezra's hand moved instinctively toward his Colt, but he knew it was useless. Against so many, he wouldn't get off more than a shot or two before they cut him down. Instead, he raised his empty hands, showing he meant no harm. The warriors descended into the canyon like shadows, surrounding Ezra and the wounded Natai. Not a word was spoken as they formed a tight circle, spears and rifles pointed inward. The chief dismounted and approached. He was older than most of the warriors, with deep lines etched into his face and silver streaking his long hair. His eyes held the weight of many battles. He knelt beside Natai, speaking rapidly in Apache. Natai responded weakly, gesturing toward Ezra several times during his explanation. The chief rose and faced Ezra, studying him with penetrating intensity. "You give water," he said in accented but clear English. "Last water, to my son." Ezra swallowed hard. The chief's son. Of all the Apache he could have encountered in the vastness of the superstitions, he'd stumbled upon the son of a war chief. "I didn't know who he was," Ezra said honestly, "just saw a man who needed help." The chief nodded slowly. "I am Delgadito. These are my people. The white soldiers call us hostiles. They hunt us because we refuse the reservation." "I'm no soldier," Ezra said, "just an old fool looking for gold." "Gold."
Delgadito spat the word. "White men die for yellow rocks. Apache die for freedom." Several warriors moved closer, their expressions hostile. Ezra could feel their hatred like a physical force. He'd heard stories of what happened to whites captured by Delgadito's band, stories that made men cross themselves and speak in whispers. "What will you do with me?" Ezra asked, finding courage in fatalism. Delgadito regarded him for a long moment. "You saved my son when you could have walked away. Why?" Ezra considered the question carefully. "Out here, the desert doesn't care what color a man's skin is. It'll kill us all the same. Seemed wrong to let it take him when I could help." The chief translated this to his warriors, who murmured among themselves. One stepped forward, speaking angrily and gesturing at Ezra. "Nahilze says you lie," Delgadito explained. "Says all white men are enemies. That you helped my son to save yourself." Ezra looked at the hostile warrior. "I gave him my last water, not knowing if I'd find more. I'd say that's the opposite of saving myself." More discussion followed, growing heated at times. Ezra remained still, knowing his fate hung in the balance of this tribal council. Finally, Delgadito raised his hand for silence. "We will take my son back to our camp to heal. The medicine woman will tend him." He fixed Ezra with a penetrating stare. "You will come also." It wasn't a request. Ezra nodded, understanding that his choices had narrowed to one path. Belle was loaded with supplies from the Apache ponies to ease her burden, and two warriors gently transferred Natai to a horse-drawn travois. As they prepared to leave, Delgadito approached Ezra again. "My son says you seek gold in these mountains." "For most of my life," Ezra admitted. The chief's face remained impassive. "Perhaps you seek the wrong treasure, white man." With that cryptic statement, he mounted his pony and gave the signal to move out. Ezra was given a pony to ride, though a warrior held its lead rope, making it clear he was still a captive. They traveled through hidden trails in the mountains, paths no white man had likely ever seen. Ezra tried to memorize the route, but the twisting canyons and identical ridges soon had him completely disoriented. By late afternoon, they reached the Apache camp, hidden in a lush valley that seemed impossible amidst the surrounding desert. Women and children emerged from wickiups to watch the procession, their expressions turning to concern when they saw Natai's condition, and to suspicion and fear when they spotted Ezra. Natai was immediately taken to a large wickiup where an ancient woman waited, her face a map of wrinkles, her eyes sharp and knowing. Ezra was directed to a small shelter at the edge of the camp and given water and a small portion of food. Two armed warriors stood guard outside.
As darkness fell, Ezra sat cross-legged in his shelter, listening to the sounds of the camp, children's laughter, women talking, the rhythmic pounding of someone working leather. It was so different from what he'd imagined all these years. Not the war camp of savages that white settlers described, but a community, a people living as they had for generations. Near midnight, Delgadito entered Ezra's shelter and sat across from him. Neither spoke for several minutes, each measuring the other in the dim light of a small fire. "My son will live," the chief finally said. "The medicine woman has drawn out the poison." Ezra nodded, genuinely relieved. "I'm glad to hear it." "You are strange for a white man," Delgadito observed. "Most would not risk themselves for an Apache." "Maybe I've been in these mountains too long," Ezra replied. "Start seeing people as people after a while." Delgadito considered this. "The council has discussed your fate. Many want your death. They have lost brothers and sons to white men's bullets." Ezra met the chief's gaze steadily. "And what do you want?" "I want peace," Delgadito said simply, "but I cannot have it. The white government offers only slow death on the reservation, or quick death if we resist." He paused. "But you are not the government. You are one man who showed kindness when there was no reason to do so." "What happens now?" Ezra asked. "Tomorrow, you will be taken back to the edge of our territory and released." Relief washed over Ezra, followed quickly by suspicion. "Just like that?" "Not just like that," Delgadito said. "You will carry a message to your people. Tell them what you have seen here. Not a camp of murderers, but families, children. Tell them we fight only because we must." Ezra nodded slowly. "I'll tell them, though I doubt they'll listen to an old prospector." "Perhaps not, but a debt must be repaid." Delgadito reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew something that caught the firelight with a dull gleam. He held it out to Ezra, a small nugget of gold. "Where?" Ezra began, but Delgadito cut him off. "There is a place 2 days' ride from where you found my son. The white men have searched for it for generations. We call it the Crying Rock, for the water that seeps from its face. At its base, the earth gives up the yellow metal your people value so highly." Ezra stared at the nugget, then back at the chief. "Why tell me this?" "Because you valued a man's life above gold and water. Such wisdom deserves reward." He stood to leave. "Rest now. Your journey begins at dawn." After the chief left, Ezra lay awake for hours, turning the gold nugget over in his fingers, its weight both familiar and strange in his hand. 20 years he'd searched, and now the secret was his. Not because he'd outsmarted the mountains or outworked his competitors, but because he'd chosen compassion over self-preservation. As promised, at dawn, Ezra was given his mule and provisions for the journey. Nate, still weak but alert, was brought out to bid him farewell. "My father says you go with our blessing," the young warrior said in his limited English. "Tell him I'm grateful," Ezra replied, "and that I'll keep my promise to share what I've seen here." Nate nodded, then added, "The gold place, it is sacred to us. Take what you need, not what you want." Before Ezra could ask what he meant, Delgadito approached, leading a young Apache warrior. "This is Torpedo. He will guide you to the boundary of our lands, then show you the way to the Crying Rock." Ezra was stunned. "You're giving me a guide?" "The mountains are treacherous for those who do not know them," Delgadito said, "and I have given my word that you will reach your destination safely." Ezra mounted Bell, still struggling to comprehend this turn of events. As he prepared to depart, the entire tribe gathered to watch. Their faces remained mostly impassive, but something had changed. He was no longer simply an enemy, but a man who had earned, if not their friendship, at least their respect. Delgadito raised his hand in farewell. "Remember your promise, Ezra Tanner. Tell your people that we are more than their nightmares." "I will," Ezra vowed. "You have my word." As he rode away, following Torpedo into the morning sun, Ezra reflected on the strange path that had led him here. He'd come to these mountains seeking gold, but had found something far more valuable, a glimpse of humanity in the most unexpected place, And, perhaps, if his words were heeded, a chance for peace in a land too long bloodied by conflict. The gold would be a welcome end to his years of searching. But it was the other treasures he'd discovered, compassion, honor, understanding, that would truly change his life, and, he hoped, the lives of others. 2 days later, as the sun set behind the superstitions, Ezra stood before the crying rock, watching as water seeped from a crack in its face, carrying with it flecks of gold that gleamed in the fading light. Tapito had left him at dawn, pointing the way to this hidden valley before disappearing back into the wilderness. Ezra knelt and scooped a handful of the wet sand, letting the water drain between his fingers, leaving behind tiny nuggets of gold. After 20 years, his search was over. Yet as he stared at the gold in his palm, Nete's words echoed in his mind. "Take what you need, not what you want." Ezra looked around at the pristine valley, untouched by mining or civilization. He thought of Delgadito and his people, fighting to preserve their way of life. And he thought of the settlements below, filled with people who saw the Apache only as savages to be feared and conquered. He closed his fist around the gold. He would take enough to live comfortably for his remaining years. But he would leave this place as he found it, its location a secret he would carry to his grave.
And he would keep his promise to Delgadito, speaking the truth to anyone who would listen about the people he had met. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, Ezra made camp beside the crying rock, listening to the gentle plink of water and gold falling together onto stone. For the first time in decades, he felt at peace, having found far greater riches than he had ever sought. In giving his last water to a dying enemy, he had not only saved a life, but found his own redemption. And in a land torn by hatred and violence, he had discovered that compassion could build bridges where none seemed possible. It was a lesson worth more than all the gold in the Superstition Mountains, a lesson he would carry forward into whatever future awaited him beyond these ancient peaks.